as well as it just being a feminist issue, it's also a development issue, it's also a health issue, and yeah, it sort of spills over into loads of other sectors, and I thought that would be an interesting place to start the discussion. So does anybody want to open up the conversation and talk a bit more about that?
Sure, I'm happy to speak on that. So, I mean, worldwide, only 29% of researchers are women. And so by investing in women's education, we're investing in our future and our nations as scientific leaders, as leaders in every potential field. Of course, my focus is science. So that's the numbers that I have. But by investing in women's education, you're forwarding policies and you're investing in decades to come. And so not only is it a high return investment, but it's a long-term investment. And, you know, educating one member of a family, if you can increase that education by one member, it'll carry on for generations. We see this all the time in college application statistics, where if you can college educate, or in this case, in these really low income areas, agriculturally based areas, if you can educate through a certain grade level for one member of a family, the likelihood of future generations in that family pursuing education is so much higher. And those resources then are expanded exponentially.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about it being a long-term investment, definitely, in terms of how the impact can keep exponentially growing for years to come. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
All I was going to say is with economics, we study like this, and one of the things that we were learning about is the rate of return on teaching women is actually higher than the rate of return with teaching men, because or girls and boys, on the whole, women and girls are more productive and motivated. And you can see this with statistics in the UK that I have stuff written down, that's why I'm looking here. At GCSE, women or girls are 10% more likely to get 5 A star to C grades at GCSE level. Like across the board, you see all the way through kind of the childhood education, primary school and secondary school, girls tend to do better than boys because of the motivation, the productivity. And so when you educate women across the world who were previously uneducated, they do the return on, it's kind of crass to say your investment, but the return on their education is way higher in terms of the positive externalities that extend through society, because their productivity and their motivation is so much higher.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, from CAMFED, just some of the analysis that we've done of our work. So we talk a lot about the multiplier effect. So the idea that once you help one girl, she goes on to help even more. And we've actually found that that is, it's likely that it's 3 times. So each girl that we support will go on to support 3 more girls. And so that's, like you said about the exponential reach, it really does work. And it's so important for us to have that long-term view, and to know that the return on the investment, although there's a bit of the word investment, you know, it's a bit not a huge fan, but that is what it is.
We replace it with, it's so difficult, isn't it?
I know. Well, I do like multiplier, which is what we use, which sort of gives the same impression, with not using such economics terms. But to be honest, educating girls for some people is an economic proposition. You know, you say if you want to make the most impact, if you want to get the most return, then this is the thing that you do. It's not purchasing capital goods or, you know, providing anything else. This is the way to reach the largest amount of people with positive change. So yeah, I'm so glad you picked that quote out, because it's just true.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm really glad. Could you maybe tell everybody a little bit more about the CAMFED Association? I mean, that popped into my mind when this quote came up. I remember when I was originally setting up Learning by Heart and I was looking for a charity to support. I think that's something that really stood out to me as unique about CAMFED, in the way that kind of cycle keeps feeding into itself. And those who have been helped by CAMFED then go on to become part of that association and give back themselves.
Yeah, totally. So it's a bit of our USP, really. So the CAMFED Association is girls who were supported by CAMFED through school. It's sort of their alumni network. So once they graduate from school, they then can then enter this, and it's sort of a women's leadership network where they can not only access even more support. So we do things like peer-to-peer mentoring, sort of business and entrepreneurship support through CAMA as well. And then the women in the CAMFED Association then go on to be leaders in their community. So because they're recognised as authorities on issues such as access to education, we found that they're then invited to local council meetings, or they meet with local chiefs in villages, and their voices are really recognised as authorities. And so the association now, there's about 150,000 women who are members now, which is fantastic. And yeah, so that's what they do, and they are truly inspirational. The things that they can achieve, especially that we've seen this year, as soon as it happened, everything was locked down. They pivoted to supplying soap, to providing masks, because they know the communities where they live in. So they knew exactly what to do, how to reach the most vulnerable children, and to support them through this time. So yeah, they are definitely our USP.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I think that says so much about the power of an educated woman. And it also brings me on very nicely, thank you for bringing up this year, because the first thing that I was going to bring up for discussion is, how do you think that COVID-19 has impacted the efforts being made to target educational inequality?
Well, I can certainly touch on this one. Currently, my county is the single worst place in the world for COVID right now. 1 in 15 people has an active case of COVID right now. And it is being felt every single day. We are 9 months in and absolutely nothing has changed. It's still quite devastating here. In terms of educational inequality, I think the best way to describe it is an exacerbation of things that are already existing. For example, we have a specific student in our organization who was just on the brink of learning how to read in kindergarten when the pandemic hit the United States in March, and students were sent home from college and workplaces were shut down, so on and so forth. These students, a lot of times when these families are struggling financially, parents are working multiple jobs, parents are working long hours, they don't have the extra time and resources at home to help their kids with homework, or they don't have the educational background themselves to help their kids, or they don't have the financial means to provide kids with those extra resources. So when teachers moved online, our education systems weren't built for that. And so there's a lot of navigating that has to happen. Every teacher had to figure out how best to manage their classroom. And so kids still, even now, aren't getting as much one-on-one attention as they would in an in-person classroom. And so we're seeing these discrepancies where kids who have extra resources at home, or who can afford to pay for extra resources, are keeping up. They're keeping up with what we set as benchmarks for reading and writing. And we see this especially in really young children, where they really need someone to sit down with them and help them learn. They don't really have the capacity to take on that learning themselves, as we see in more high school age students. So we're seeing even wider disparities between our students. So for example, in my county, only 20% of young Black women in our education system read at grade level. And the average median income for a Black family in my county is significantly lower. It's only about 40% of the average median income for a white family in my county. And you see these discrepancies all over the state, all over the nation. And so these families have fewer financial resources. So they're not paying for a tutor, they're not paying for extra educational help. And these parents are working long hours, or maybe they're even unemployed as a result of COVID. And so these kids aren't learning how to read, they aren't learning how to write, they aren't keeping up in class. And it's because of a lack of access to resources. And it really does boil down to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you've said, especially those statistics that you gave. I've been reading a lot recently about the attainment gap in the UK between kids from higher income and lower income backgrounds. And that's been widening this year, actually for the first time in about a decade, and it's obviously widening now more because of the impact of the pandemic. And it does come down to those things you were talking about, the amount of time that parents have to spend with their children at home, the amount of resources, the amount of knowledge that they can give to their children, because children are relying a lot more on their families when they've been at home in lockdown and unable to go to school, and all sorts of other factors that come into play, and the spotlight's really shone on them. Now everybody's spending so much time at home, people's home circumstances make such a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's the opposite of the multiplier effect that Helena was talking about, where, you know, if in that household you have a parent that's college educated, you have a parent that's able to get a little bit better job, bring in a little bit more money to the family, maybe that allows them to spend more time at home, and it helps these kids through this pandemic. But, you know, here you're seeing the reverse of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, Chris took the word right out of my mouth, which was exacerbated. And so, yeah, the whole CAMFED was founded to try and get girls back into school. And so now this has just been a huge knockback, because we're no longer fighting against what we were doing before, which is the financial aspect, the support aspect, which is that now we physically cannot get them back into schools. And across the world, about 7 million girls are at risk of not returning to school at all after this. And the reasons are the same as, unfortunately, as previously. So they are at risk of child marriage. They're at risk of early pregnancy, which means that in some of the countries where we work, they would legally not be allowed to return to school, even if they could afford to. About 25% less likely than boys to return to school after a crisis because of those issues. And so, yeah, it has, although it is unprecedented, to use that dreaded word, it has exacerbated problems that already existed. And so we found some good results so far with schools reopening, but with re-enrollment rates for girls that we've supported, but the ones who have not returned are because of those existing problems. So.
I was just going to say, I know it's not my specific area, but when I was doing research on this, it's following on from what Helena said. I looked at the Ebola pandemic and how that affected girls in Africa and their return rates to school. And like you said, there was a lower return rate to school because there was more sexual violence, exploitation, and school closures and teenage pregnancies. And then they wouldn't let those girls return back to school if they were visibly pregnant. They were banned from school. And so I feel like we're facing the exact same risks this time again. And I was watching BBC News, I think it was, and they were showing footage from Africa and the surge in child marriages that's expected from this because of the economic kind of problems with families. They're turning to using child marriage to kind of help that, which is obviously awful. But yeah, like I said, not my area, but I just thought I'd add that in.
No, it's a really interesting add-in. Thank you, Heather. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add before we move on to the next point of discussion?
I just think it's interesting, and I think we should point out, we talk about how, like, you know, educational systems, in my experience and where I'm based, have, you know, included women for a long time, but we're still seeing the residual effects that mirror the same issues. We're still seeing the effects of, you know, younger girls having children earlier on, getting married earlier and dropping out of school or not being able to pay for education. And so you can really see the correlations, how you know, socio-political views can really impact even with an existing education system that includes women, because it really wasn't built for that. And that's why we have to so radically change and impact our current education systems.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd also just like to talk a little bit more about the flip side. You mentioned briefly earlier, Helena, about how the women you support are responding to the pandemic, and I think that we'd all really love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there's The one that really struck me was the use of radio. So we work a lot in rural, isolated areas where, schools in this country have, a lot of them have been able to pivot to virtual learning. Obviously, that wasn't possible. And so we have a program called My Better World. It's sort of like PSHE/citizenship. So it tells you about money management and sex and relationships, that sort of thing. And we already had that as a radio program. That was something in development. But now what we found is that that's been so crucial in getting girls to keep learning at home. So that would either be a shared radio somewhere or in their own homes. We also had, CAMA members who are distributing materials, and not just masks and hand sanitizer and soap, because obviously there is still a huge issue with access to clean water. And so manufacturing soap is a huge one as well. But also just dropping off textbooks, checking in with girls as well is something that's been hugely important, just to make sure that they stay on track. And so the work that we've done isn't pushed back in looking after them and making sure that they know that they're supported and that someone's there for them. They don't have to turn to early marriage and early pregnancy to get by.
Definitely. I think that's a really good wider point about the pandemic, really. I think checking in so many ways is such a simple thing that you can do, but can make so much of a difference to somebody. So I think that's a really good point there that you've raised. Okay, I'll move on. So the next thing that we wanted to discuss is how are students, and particularly BAME and female students in the UK, being let down by the education system. So obviously this is a little bit more one for Helena and Heather, but Chris, I don't know how, maybe you could talk a little bit about the US education system. We can adapt the question for you.
So I had a lot to kind of look at with this. I was like furiously writing so many notes, but the big things that personally, obviously there's so much to cover, but some of the big things that I think is a massive failure of the UK education system is the PSHE, for example, the kind of sex education that people receive. It's failing boys and it's failing girls, specifically girls, but obviously it's failing boys too because they don't know what they're doing wrong, but obviously what they're doing wrong is affecting girls. So I feel like it's mainly affecting girls, but also it's affecting the BAME students and also LGBTQ plus students, because it doesn't give you a wider, broader education on relationships past. It's so heteronormative in its process and its result in terms of what it teaches you and how it teaches you. And it doesn't kind of give kids that acceptance, or especially from what I've experienced. And obviously I can't speak for every school, but on the whole, the curriculum isn't fit for purpose in terms of being inclusive of women and BAME students and LGBTQ plus. I'd say particularly, I know that's not specifically in the question, but that does come up a lot. And sport is a massive one. When I was looking at this, I found lacrosse is a very interesting thing, because in the UK you've got your female sports of netball, maybe volleyball and stuff like that, and then you've got your rugby and your football of male sports. And then when you've got lacrosse, you look in America, and this is just from my American housemates, so I'm not exactly confident, but I played lacrosse school with Naomi, and we played in what Colin, my housemate, would call girls lacrosse, but he played boys lacrosse, because they had completely different rules, because the boys were full contact and the girls didn't, and they had different rules. And it was one of those things that, like, the way that it was taught was completely different for both women and men. And I was thinking, in the UK, in my school, it was a girls' sport, but then I see it on TV and it's a boys' sport. So the way that it's taught in the UK is a girls' sport, and it highlights that kind of, even though it's the exact same sport, it's the exact same game, it's played completely differently because of girls and boys. and the way that the education system does split you up that way. And when you learn PSHE and the whole grammar school, boys and girls schools, that's a whole other thing. But PSHE, they split you up in, you learn in boys and girls sometimes when you have that sex ed talk, and it just kind of divides people, and it divides it. And also the boys and girls don't necessarily get taught the same thing. Boys don't get taught about periods and contraception and like abortions and kind of like that kind of female, all the stuff that they are directly involved in that women have to go through. And so when they get older, they're completely oblivious and they don't know all of this stuff. And they, for example, the stigma around periods, they're all like, oh my God, that's so weird, that's so odd. And it hinders women massively because they're never taught about this stuff in school. And it's doing them a disservice because they're not learning the stuff they should be learning, but it's doing women a massive disservice because it's perpetuating stigmas and stuff that we're having to live with and walk around with of completely like normal things. And it causes, the other thing, the massive thing with the curriculum is we're taught majority, you know what I mean, we're taught on the most part for looking at people like Shakespeare and Watson and Crick and things like that, the dead white men is what we're learning about, when actually there are massive movements have been made by women across the years. And like I especially remember learning about DNA, and the discovery of the double helix was by Watson and Crick, but actually it was also discovered by Rosalind Franklin, who died I think 5 years later with no recognition of cancer. I think, fact check me on that, but she, because of all the work she did, she died because she discovered this helix, and she never ever got any recognition. Well, she did now, but at the time she didn't get any recognition for it. And when we learn it, you hear Watson and Crick, it's the big headline and her name's written in small and things like that. Like our curriculums are saturated completely. Whereas like, instead of looking at Shakespeare, where's Mallory Blackman, the author of Noughts and Crosses and things like that? There are amazing women of colour who have written amazing poets, novelists. Where are they in the curriculum? The same way that that men are. Like Michael Gove, I think in 2018, he did an educational reform, and two of the things he put on the education system is we had to learn to a writer from the British Isles and a poet from the British Isles or something like that. But I don't understand when the scope of education should be so much wider than just people that came from the British Isles who are going to be old white men. Like where's the further education past that?
Yeah,
that's a lot.
that was brilliant. Yeah, I think you've got a lot of really good points to touch on there. My first thought when you were speaking about sex education was actually, I'd just like to draw attention to it. I'm going to have to give my sister a little shout out, because I know that she's here, and recently she has been in contact with an amazing charity, which I can't remember the name of, so I'm going to ask Katja if you're here to put it in the chat, of a charity that trains up university students to go into schools with their permission, obviously, and give a more LGBTQ plus friendly sex education, which I think is a really interesting idea. So I just thought it might be worth highlighting if anybody wanted to go and look into that after today. Because yeah, I think you made some really good points. I think everybody in the UK who's had it knows just how completely useless and inadequate UK sex education is in so many ways, not just in terms of failing LGBTQ plus people, but failing everyone in some way. And the way that sport and everything is separated, learning is separated, and how that perpetuates the divide in school. Yeah, obviously you guys have probably picked up on the fact that me and Heather went to school together, and just the awkwardness of the boys and girls in little groups standing outside apart from each other, unable to talk to one another, is crazy. And I really do think that all the things you mentioned contribute to that. I think they both feed into each other. And then finally, I think you mentioned a really good thing when you were talking about sort of the very narrow dynamic of the books we study and just the content that we learn in school. And we spoke about this. This was brought up in a debate in Anti-Racism Society, which was set up by my friend at Durham the other day, and I just think that it's a really interesting thing to address. One of my one of the people at the event brought up how on his English course at Durham University, he had until third year never been given the option to do a module where he could study really anything that wasn't written by a white person. And so I think it's just a really interesting topic of discussion. You know, how do we change that? How do we, from the position that we're in, how do we fight that? It's so ingrained. But yeah, I think you brought up loads of really interesting things to talk about. I can see some things have gone in the chat. I'll just have a look at what they are. But carry on. If any of Helena or Chris wants to add something while I do that, then please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the point of the sports because, like most things, again, this has been exacerbated by lockdown. So there's a female footballer who's based here in Cambridge, and she actually did was it a tweet or Insta post or something? Basically, when they were reopening the country and talk about amateur sports, men's amateur sport was allowed to reopen, but women's weren't. It was something to do with women's football not being classed as elite. So they reopened elite football, but because of how that's categorized, women weren't allowed to play football, which is just insane.
Yeah.
So that was a local one that I saw on the news that was so true, you know, that anyway. And then the other one on period poverty, absolutely. Thankfully, you might have seen the news today that MSPs in Scotland voted to offer free period products in all public places, which is fantastic. The government did promise many things to provide period products or reduce the VAT. I can't remember which one it was, but they still haven't delivered on it. Just context, I used to work for a different charity and we gave out some of the grants from basically the proceeds of VAT were given to charitable organisations to then distribute to women-led organisations for projects supporting women. That's happened, but I would say definitely period poverty is still an issue. This is something that we work on in our countries as well, to provide period products for girls because it is such a huge problem with keeping them out of school. And also educating their families and communities about what it actually means and that girls can keep learning even if they're on the period, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's having to do that education in this country. It's a global issue as well for where we work and in the UK.
Definitely. And I think that ties into what we were saying before about not educating, especially boys, about those women's issues like periods. If we're not educating the entire population about these issues, then there'll be people that then don't understand why there are girls that are not attending school. And it just, yeah, they all feed into each other and it exacerbates that situation of girls being out of school. I just wanted to draw attention to that has just been put in the chat now, the organisation that I mentioned that train up students to go into schools and give LGBTQ+ education. It's called Just Like Us, and Katya has kindly put the link in the chat if anybody wants to go and research that after today. It's a really great charity.
I would love to just take a second and take this question in a little bit of a different direction.
Absolutely.
So another area that I think we have to recognize that our education systems are letting down women is in STEM fields in particular. Studies in the US have shown that entering kindergarten, there is no discrepancy between female students and male students in terms of their brute knowledge. But the actual views by educators on those students, there actually is a significant standard deviation between the views of potential among male versus female students. And by second or third grade, that discrepancy is comparable to the Black-white education gap in the United States. And so our gender-based issues in our education systems are just as problematic as our race-based issues in our education systems. And they're very much linked. And I think, as Heather was talking about, it's so important, not just in the people that you study in these classes, but also in the figures that are leaders in these fields, to be representative. We found that our students do infinitely better when they are paired with a tutor that they identify with, whether that be within the LGBTQ+ community within an ethnic or racial identity, within a gender identity, et cetera. And so I think it's important to recognize that students do a lot better and see more potential for themselves, and others actually see more potential in them when they're studying people that identify similarly. And you've seen this all across the US when the Biden-Harris ticket won our election. And it was a huge, huge turning point for women of color in education, for our BIPOC women to see Kamala Harris as our vice president-elect. And, you know, we've seen initiatives blow up all across the United States supporting BIPOC women and women in education. And of course, now we also have Jill Biden, a campaigner for women's education and community college education, who now has the position of First Lady in the White House. And so I'm really excited for progress, hopefully on our education systems between the two, for women in our education systems and BIPOC women in our education systems. But I think it's really important to recognize that in these high intensity fields and traditionally difficult fields like STEM classes specifically, and even more so in math, we see a lot of the statistics worsen when talking about math. You know, we don't have the college graduation rates for women in those fields. We don't have the representation at higher level education for women and BIPOC folks in those fields. We don't, you know, after about second or third grade, the discrepancy exists.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Yeah, and I'd like to congratulate you again and celebrate with you on Biden's victory. Chris was campaigning very hard last time we met. She was very stressed, bless her. She lives in a swing state. So yeah,
we turned blue. My state voted for Trump in 2016 and voted for Biden in 2020. And we have a lot of work to do. I mean, the fact that it was a close race tells me that there's a lot of hate in this country, and a lot of phobias, and a lot of things that we need to work on. And feminism is a really important one. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I'm really hopeful.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to your point about STEM subjects. I think that's definitely a topic in itself, and math specifically. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I definitely have my own stories even from that. I remember being told, I think this is just a demonstration of how much individual attention and how much tiny things can affect this. I was told when I was 15, when I was picking my A-levels by a tutor of mine, she recommended that I didn't take maths A-level because she thought, oh, your strengths lie elsewhere a little bit. You'll do it a little bit better in another subject. And I ignored her advice and took the first year. I took the AS level when I was 16. And I got one of the best grades in my year group. I really did incredibly in this exam. And my teachers were really proud of me, and they told me to carry on. I was at a new school at this point, and they really wanted me to continue. But in the back of my mind, that her comment still stuck with me. And I remember thinking, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I can do that final year. It's going to be so much more difficult. And I took English instead. I think this whole right brain, left brain discourse really got to me. And I thought, no, you know, I'm more, I can't remember which one's which. I want to say left-brained is the creative one, but I'm probably wrong. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm an essay person. I'm a creative. And I took that and I hated every second of it. And it was only years later, I was 20, when I took a course with Code First Girls, which I know, Heather, you promote a lot within Cardiff SU Fem Society. And that was the first time in years I'd really felt capable of doing something STEM related and using that side of my brain. And it's not that I lacked that capability, it's just that I lacked the belief in myself. And that was perpetuated by my teachers, by my mentors, who were pushing me down that creative route. Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting point.
I actually have had some similar experiences. So I study chemistry and math in addition to other things at a top university here in the US. And the number of times that somebody asks, what's your major? And you say a core STEM, you say something like chemistry or physics or applied math. And they're like, really? It's absurd. It really is. And even within my class, even within my own class at school, a really open-minded campus, and a really, really well-educated campus, there's still a lot of like, are you really cut out for that? And it's like, yes, I am. It's difficult for everybody. It's not a question of anybody's gender or race or other identifiers. It doesn't make anyone less worthy or less accomplished. And it's absurd that is a question that's on the table.
Just to add to what you were saying, I did biology, chemistry, and maths at school, and our school was more boys than girls, I think. And the attitude of the boys towards that, I was in very male-dominated classes. It was all boys, really. I think it was 2 girls in my chemistry class. But every single time someone asked what I did as my A-levels, I said, oh, biology, chemistry, and maths. They're like, are you sure? Really? We got this crazy kind of like pushback as if I was lying. And even now, like when I'm out and about and I say I do economics and politics, and people are like, economics, like people they have like this kind of disbelief, and I it bugs me so much, and I talk about it so frequently with my peers, because it just gets to me and it really angers me, as that surprise that, I don't know if it's because I'm a woman, well, it's definitely because I'm a woman, but additional factors, whether it's because I'm on the side, I have my own beauty business and I'm a makeup artist, self-taught, but like, I don't know if it's that, but every single time they're like, are you sure? And everyone presumes that I'm a hairdresser or that I'm this or I'm that, and I'm like, no, why is this assumption so prevalent through women that we aren't capable of the mathsy subjects and the STEM subjects? And it just time and time again, I have all these micro little stories of all the times when boys have had an adverse reaction to me saying that, or like when you say, like when I'm a massive rugby fan, I say I support rugby, and they're like, okay, who's your favorite rugby player? Okay, well, who's your favorite team? Okay, and it's like that you have to prove that you are in STEM subjects, or you have to prove that you are interested in what you're interested in, because you're a woman and that isn't like expected of you, which just makes me so angry.
I think, Heather, you bring up a really interesting point here, in that even if you are a woman in some of these really intense male-dominated areas and subjects, that there's this expected lack of femininity, like things that are traditionally feminine. Like you mentioned, like makeup, like the looks you get from walking into lab with fake lashes on. It's absurd. It's like there's this assumed, even if you identify as a woman, you use she series pronouns or you use non-binary pronouns, there's this assumption of masculinity in order to even take on these subjects. It's like you can't possibly look good and study physics, like identify as a very feminine woman and still do these things. I've run into that myself as well, and it's a very interesting dichotomy. And you even see it among women who dress more masculine and cut their hair short to try to sort of fit in with their male cohorts and feel like this sense of belonging that their femininity doesn't allow them to feel. It's a really nuanced and niche interaction between different identities within genders, and how that sort of plays into sort of STEM communities and really intense subject studies that are male dominated.
Yeah, I think it also comes back to what you were saying earlier, Heather, about role models, and about like, where do we get these ideas from? And perhaps one of the reasons that it's so difficult for somebody to comprehend that there might be, a makeup artist who also studies physics or is in STEM, who's a very feminine STEM student, might be that they don't have examples of that to refer back to from what they were taught.
Well, a lot of successful women in history had to present themselves as men for their own safety. I mean, how many times have we heard stories of women fighting in wars, dressing up as men in order to pass off, or, female scientists who wouldn't wear a dress because they didn't want to be seen by society in that way. Like, the role models in history are often equally masculine.
And when you saying that in terms of like, oh, women have to act or dress a certain way to kind of get that respect or whatever, you see when they don't, if you take the Brexit versus Lexit title that happened with, I think it was Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon or Angela Merkel, I can't remember the second woman on the cover, but they were at a Brexit talk and the headline was Brexit or Lexit, because they were both wearing skirts, and it was just literally like a camera shot of their legs, and it was kind of a downwards angle, but it was focusing on their legs, and it was talking about their legs because they didn't dumb themselves down. And also Theresa May, I think, got a bunch of rubbish thrown at her for wearing leopard print shoes at one point, I remember that. But just, you see it in politics all the time, women that dress the way that they want to, expressing femininity, get so much stuff thrown at them for doing that because of the way. And also there was the woman, I think it might have been 2016, but she there was the upskirting. There was this woman, she was upskirted and she pushed forward a massive reform about upskirting and making it, criminalizing it in and she was going to court and stuff, and she said that she originally started going to court and she was wearing suits and browns and blacks because she was like, this is what I should do, this is how I'm going to be respected, this is how I'm going to fit in. And then she had a moment of realization where she was like, why is it just because I'm wearing black or brown, or why is it because I'm dressing like a man in my suits, is that going to earn me respect? And she threw it out the window and started wearing whatever she wanted to wear. But it is just such a prevalent thought in women's minds as to what they can wear and how they can do their makeup and what shoes they can wear, because you just step 1 foot wrong and you just don't get that respect, and you have to kind of not dumb yourself down, but act in not the way that you'd want to, the same way that men would never have to think about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the woman you were talking about is isn't it Gina Martin?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. She's got a really great Instagram, if anybody wants to take a look at it. She puts some great activism bits and bobs out, and it's also just really, really beautiful feed. I'll write the name in the chat if anybody wants to look her up.
I think importantly to include in this discussion, just like as a general summation, like it's not even just female students that are affected by these stereotypes and these underlying emotions that are conveyed by educators, by leaders, by a lack of role models, so on and so forth. It's not just female students, it's feminine identifying students. You even see it among men who enjoy dressing in what is traditionally seen as feminine clothing, which obviously, clothing has no gender, but we have societal perceptions of clothing. And so important that we sort of loop it all together as, perceptions made upon traditionally feminine expression, whether or not one identifies as female.
Definitely. That's a good point. Does anybody have anything to add before I move on to the next point?
I did just want to add one thing quickly, because it's my kind of main, something I talk about so frequently, but it's not like a classic failure, but personally, in my opinion, a massive failure of the educational system, going all the way back to the question, is the fact that our society breeds typically toxic men. If you think about the term toxic masculinity and how that impacts women in statistics, coming from Cardiff University, we have the second highest groping, I don't mean to put it in quote marks, but it's a wide kind of thing, public sexual harassment, groping in clubs. So 95% of Cardiff University students have experienced groping in a club here. And in my eyes, one of the ways that you can kind of not impose, but teach kids, obviously, is through education. You can't tell parents how to parent their kids, but you can teach them in school. That is something that can nationally be put across. So why is it that why hasn't education taken any measures to try and stop this toxic masculinity, in terms of like, why is it that all these things start on the playground? The fact that boys pull a girl's hair and the girl's told, oh, he probably likes you, and boys are allowed to get away with that behavior because boys will be boys, and then calling it boys will be boys is devalidating that the severity of what they're doing. And then it continues to get exacerbated and the trajectory goes off, and then you've got sexual violence and stuff like that in society. And there should be a massive push in like getting rid of gender stereotypes in schools, and encouraging men to be expressive, and encouraging men to feel and stuff like that, and stop throwing around the kind of boys will be boys, be manly, don't cry. And instead of just like focusing on like bullying is a massive thing, but kind of also looking at stopping the perpetuation of gender stereotypes in school, and allowing kids to, instead of worrying not what they are, but to express who they are. And then hopefully we can breed a society with kind of more open and happier kids, and hopefully take away some of that toxic masculinity. It's a massive problem in my eye. Well, it's a massive problem, but I speak about it very frequently, and I use it quite a lot when I'm talking to boys, because trying to get them involved in feminism, I'm like, it does affect you too, come on, like, please be on my side. But I think that how have we not used schools? Why is that not taught in schools? Why does no one talk about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think some of the things you've mentioned are so small and easy to implement as well. I mean, we spoke earlier about sex education. There's so much emphasis, at least from my experience, in that put on pregnancy. God forbid you get a woman pregnant. Sexually harass her, that's fine, that's not mentioned. But pregnancy, no, that's the worst. It doesn't make sense to me. Or how much time out of a PSHE lesson would it take to just briefly address that groping women in a club is not okay? Maybe 5 or 10 minutes, because it's not a long conversation. It's just a big no. But yeah, it's these things that they're stigmatized, and they're not brought up, but they're so important. Okay, I think we should move on to the next question. This one was clearly a very fruitful one. Maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A at the end. Lots of interesting points made there. Thank you to the whole panel. So yeah, this is definitely a very good one for you, Helena, to start with, I think, but everybody's welcome to contribute. So how do we think education has already impacted women across the world, and how can it impact them in the future?
I mean, where to start?
It's quite a big question, sorry.
Yeah, it's such a big one. I'm always hopeful. We're always looking to the future. So in terms of that one, I mean, just to pick on a really hot topic at the moment, obviously with climate change, we've been doing some work on that as well, because where CAMFED works is mainly like a rural areas in the countries. And so the vast majority of people work in agriculture. They have either small holdings or their own farms, etc. And there's a couple of things there specifically related to mitigating both climate change and the effects of climate change on those communities and the world that education is really important in. And so just basically, when you educate women, they are not only able to run their own businesses more efficiently, more environmentally friendly, they then, if you give women the same tools as men, they will give a greater return. And so what that means for farming, where we work, is that there's a greater crop yield. So if you educate women, there's literally more food to go around in these countries where there might be food insecurity. You might have seen recently about issues with drought and locusts in sub-Saharan Africa. And so if we did educate women and they then become farmers, there's an average increase of about 25% for farming yield. And therefore, there would be 100 million fewer people who live in hunger. And
Wow.
so that, yeah, it's a huge number. And for me, we're doing so much more work now on what we call this climate smart agriculture. And it might seem so far away from educating a girl in primary school, but it's the end of that trajectory. So you educate a girl, she can then go on to set up her own business, she can employ other people, she can then resist climate change, drought, flooding. We had a cyclone a couple of years ago, which affected a lot of where we work. And it's beneficial not only to them, but also to the whole planet for reducing emissions. Obviously, not that many emissions anyway, but in terms of, developing these practices that are climate smart. I thought that's just one really great example of the far-reaching positive changes of educating women.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really interesting point. And again, it was one of the things I remember first reading about when I researched you guys. And it's one of those links that maybe you don't immediately think of, that female education would spill over into. And I think your website and all of your promotional material articulated that really well. And that really attracted me to CAMFED, because yeah, you were able to really articulate how it's important in so many different ways.
Just following on from what Helena said, it's basically exactly what you said, but I just found it, studying economics, one of my modules is development economics, so we study the development of countries, and I was not surprised, but was surprised because I rarely hear kind of feminist themes coming through in normal economics. You never hear kind of feminism and women in economics because it's such a male dominated field. But in development economics, so much of what we're studying is about women and how important it is that you educate women, because they're one of the single most important things for a country to become developed. Like, and it does kind of, when I was looking at it earlier, I said to my friend, I was like, it does kind of make me a bit sad that we're reducing educating women down to just for the good of developing the country in terms of the economy and stuff like that, because ultimately that girl does deserve that education the same way that I have had access to education and stuff like that. But if you look at it from an economic standing point, if you're looking at it from purely just the facts and figures, it is like, it's the most important thing in development. And if you want to develop countries and you want to end poverty and things like that, you need to be focusing on the women and bringing the women up and educating the women.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, you can make, fundamentally it is an inherent good to educate women and girls. That just goes without saying. But if people do want to know about the economic impact, you can take, it's not even that it improves or it's good for the country. It's more effective than educating, well, not educating them, but there's a statistic that we know, which is if you increase a woman's income by $10, it increases children's nutrition the same amount as if you'd increased a man's income by 110. So $100 cheaper, or it would be $100 more to get the same result. So it's not even that it's better, it's that it is the best thing that you can do.
Wow, those are some really interesting statistics. Thank you for sharing those. I'm going to, I think, share in the chat once I've stopped sharing my screen. I just read a really simple article, which I think everybody should read. I shared it on the Learning by Heart LinkedIn, I think. But the Central Asia Institute did an article in July this year, which is just called The Top 10 Reasons to Support Girls' Education. And it just addresses some of the points that you've been bringing up already. But I think it's a really interesting read. So I'll share that when I stop sharing my screen, if anybody wants to have a look at that too. Okay, does anybody want to add anything on this, on the impact of educating women? Or I think we've got one more discussion point to move on to if people are ready to move on. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so yeah, the final question for today is a little bit about what we were talking about before about spillover. So in what ways does educational inequality fuel wider inequality, such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, etc.? And then following on from that, I think it'd be interesting to discuss what we can do to prevent that, what we can do to help.
Well, all of these things are interconnected for sure. I mean, we can look at our public school systems and correlate low-income areas to higher minority majority areas, all the way to having lower funding in public schools. There is a direct correlation in a lot of areas, especially nearby to where we work. In addition, by not having support, you see huge differences in graduation rates among all sorts of things. For example, in the United States, bisexual women are 62% less likely to complete a high school degree than they are compared to their cis, straight, white, male counterparts. That's a huge gap, 62% less likely. So, and then again, this gets back to the magnifier effect. If you have one person of a certain gender identity, race identity, sexual orientation. However, that effect will be magnified either positively or negatively. Whether you have a family where someone wasn't able to complete a degree because they didn't have enough educational support, well, now the pressure may not be as high on those kids to complete a education. The parent may not have extra resources to help provide those kids to get through their education because they don't have the income, because the parent didn't complete the education. It's cyclic. And so it obviously does work the reverse, and we can take advantage of that system and support students of regardless of background, identity, or gender, anything, because it will magnify in the direction that we want it to.
That's a very good point.
I think the main thing that strikes me with this question is just like it's kind of, you don't need any expertise or anything like that. It's just clear that the people that you give opportunities to are the people that are going to succeed further. Like if you look at the difference between people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, the whole private school, state school debate and things like that, the people that are given the opportunities are the people that are going to succeed. So if you're holding back girls, for example, with STEM subjects and stuff, and they're not getting the same opportunities or not being encouraged in the same way, then they're not going to be succeeding in the same way because they're not getting the encouragement or the opportunities. And that's a massive thing, is encouraging women, and especially women of color, to proceed in those industries where they're already underrepresented. Because if we perpetuate the underrepresentation, then it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And it's the equal opportunity versus equal outcome debate, in terms of like, you need to start that equal opportunity from childhood, from when they first start taking in information, from the toys that you give the kids to what they learn in school and what sport they take, and you encourage them to be completely equal in what they're allowed to do and what they're encouraged to do. Then you're going to create instead of having to say, oh, we need 50% of this job to be male and female, you'll have 50% to choose from, or closer to, because they'll be given equal opportunities from all the way at the beginning. This is completely socially constructed in our differences in the workplace. It's not like men are better at the stock market or men are better at being engineers. It's just because growing up, that's the way you see things like that. And even in the army and stuff like that, like obviously that's like a very difficult thing, but why is it not just based on merit? Why is it women and men? Why is it not just, if you're strong enough, you're strong enough? Like there should be definitely, like a girl we went to school with is now in the army, and she won the best grenade thrower or something like that, and it was this massive thing because she was the best of her class. It had nothing to do with whether she was a woman or not. And obviously I probably wouldn't make it in the army, clearly, but there are women that could. So just do it on based if you're good enough, not based on whether you're a woman or a man, and just show people that that's something that's open to them. That's a pathway that they're open to. And I talk a lot obviously about women, but this extends past women. It's the same with race and socioeconomic status. You need to show people that these opportunities, they haven't got a trajectory already planned out from them being born in the way that they've been born, in the gender that they identify in, and in their ethnicity. That doesn't give them already a trajectory as to where they're going to end up. The world is full of opportunities, and they need to be allowed to reach their full potential with any opportunities that we should give them more opportunities, if you see what I mean.
I do, exactly. And I think, yeah, it comes back to what you were saying earlier about visibility and how important that is. And I love the grenade story. I think that's brilliant.
I think one thing we have to touch on, though, in the discussion of feminism, the core of feminism is equality. And so just like we push women to explore STEM careers, and that's what we expose them to, and that's something I work closely in, is like, how can we encourage science enrichment for young women? We also have to encourage male participation in traditionally female or feminine jobs. You know, like men can be nurses the same way women can be doctors. You know, it's like, it's exactly what you're saying, Heather. It's what you're good at. What are, like, where is your skill set? How can you best, you know, further yourself and further your society? It shouldn't have to do with gender. And that definitely goes both ways.
Yeah.
And obviously there are more than two genders, and we could go on about that forever.
Yeah, I think you've made a very good point. I think that's quite an overlooked area as well. I mean, women in STEM has become, I think, quite a buzzword over the past couple of years. But yeah, there hasn't been the same equivalent for men. And I mean, I'm not even sure what you'd call all of those female-centered careers, because there are so many vastly different ones. So maybe that's why
it's still important, because the rates of men occupying traditionally feminine jobs like nursing, teaching, things like this are growing faster than the rates of women in traditionally male dominated areas. And obviously there are more of those. And so like this is not to say at all that we shouldn't be concentrating our efforts on getting women into male dominated courses and subjects and fields. But I mean that it does work in all possible directions, regardless of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, you know, so on and so forth. There's discrepancies in every possible field, subject, anything, no matter where you look.
Absolutely.
Like what you were saying, I find myself, I'm consistently male dominated, and I live in a house with mostly boys, and I'm constantly talking about this stuff. And what I always find the pushback is the kind of, yeah, but men, etc., etc., etc. And there is so much to be said for the inequality that is felt by men. But in my opinion, and something that I frequently remind them is, it's like, if you take, I know that this isn't the question, but if you take the sexual assault statistics, there are so many vastly different ones that you can use. But for example, one that I looked up that I found earlier was 1 in 5 women, 20% of women opposed to 4% of men experience sexual violence in their lifetime. So there is a problem for both, but there's a very clear bigger problem for women. So even though that there is a problem, there is so many problems for men too, but it's just like, where's the priority? And also, that doesn't even need to be a priority. Why is it an argument against feminism that men have problems too? Yeah, I know. Just like, why can't we end it all together? Why is it men versus women? It isn't. It's everyone together. It's kind of, some of my housemates will say, oh yeah, but men get sexually assaulted too. And the statistic that I'll give them is that 90% of sexual violence committed against women is by men, and 93% of sexual violence against men is by men. So it still is, it's kind of like everyone against the bad people. Do you see what I mean? It's not women against men, it's the people that are perpetuating this. And so when you take, as you were saying about the male dominated and the female dominated industries, there is an inequality in both, but it's kind of like there's a bigger inequality, I would say, with the women. And also, if you take the kind of socioeconomic status of the jobs that men go into, they tend to be the higher paying jobs, the better opportunities kind of thing. It's a massive generalization, but if you think about like the mathsy, the sciencey, the economic, engineering opposed to the teaching, and the amount of money they bring in, and therefore the kind of, you go back to the money and power kind of thing, which is just something to be mentioned.
Definitely. I think I completely agree with what you're saying. And it's just this constant misjudgment of feminism as pitting women against men. And it's never been about women against men. It's about everybody against sexism. And it's so important to make that differentiation. Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Helena?
Yeah, I was just remembering we did an event last year, and we get this question a lot. Campaign for female education, what about boys, all that sort of stuff. We get that a lot. And someone asked this in person at an event, and it was being run by Faith, who runs our programs in Zimbabwe. And she said, in response to the question, that there are brothers. And so they, like you said, men have a vested interest in improving the lives of women, everyone else. But you always get that thing, it's like, oh, I have sisters, I have daughters. it benefits everyone, even if you don't have female relatives. This is a positive benefit for society for both men and women. So that's one that we get all the time. Asked about, do we support boys? And in some districts we do. And one of the ways that we do that, for example, is, again, improving situations that benefit everyone. One of the ones that we have is safeguarding, which is a huge issue in the UK as well, but especially in the countries where we support, where, you know, you're looking after vulnerable children, and children might be vulnerable because they have their parents have passed away, or, you know, other situations like that. They benefit from the improved situations of their whole community valuing education, valuing safeguarding, and having improved facilities. So yeah, I really like that line from Faith, which says they're our brothers and therefore they care about us. And not only do they benefit too, but they have a vested interest in it.
Yeah. I think it feels, I mean, even silly that you have to justify it in the first place. I feel like personally, as a feminist, and I've recently engaged with my feminism a lot more, it's just so draining constantly having to justify it to other people like it's something controversial. I mean, everything we've said, it literally benefits everybody. It benefits you, even that person who's arguing with you about feminism. They might not know it, but what you're doing will ultimately benefit them too. And it just gets so frustrating, I think, after a while, just constantly having to justify this thing that to me seems so obvious, and seems so important to everybody, not just to women.
It's got the most kind of like the nicest, most innocent aspirations in its core of equality, and I don't understand how I so frequently am sat saying, no, that's not what it's about, no this, no that, or like, and I've said to the boys in my house and friends of mine, I say, if you want to say something, say it, and if it's wrong, then we can sit and chat about it, or if I don't think that's quite right, we can sit and chat about it, but I don't want you to not say something because you're worried that I'm going to jump down your neck about it and be like, no, you shouldn't say that, blah, blah, blah. But like, so frequently I'm just flabbergasted by stuff that gets said, and I'm like, oh, that's not true. And I find myself so frequently defending myself and being stood on the defensive about feminism, and I'm like, we're literally just trying to do a good thing for everyone, and in recognizing that women are the most affected and in its core, but it's still for everyone. And I always go on about, so we're talking, as we were earlier, about what about boys. We've got such a polarized idea of gender, of female and male, and to stray from that is seen as bad. And so when people stray from that and you see, a male acting more effeminate and a woman acting more masculine and things like that, and that transfers over into the job sectors, in terms that nursing is seen as more feminine, and because a man is going to a more feminine industry, it's not the fact that he's helping people, it's because it's more feminine, which is why he's kind of having people have an issue with it. And it's that kind of destigmatization and getting rid of the gender stereotypes from early on that can really help everyone, because it allows people to just do what they want. Like Chris said earlier, do what you're good at, fulfill your skills without having to worry about what your gender is kind of putting on you from that very early age. Because from the minute I was handed a Barbie and told to wear pink, it already gave me like, this is where I'm off to. And the same way that my brothers were given kind of Lego and JBL trucks, but I would never have got that because I'm a girl, so I can't.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a nice way to start to close the discussion. I think it ties in really well to the overall theme of feminism and education, because I think we're getting into education about feminism, and kind of busting those myths that people have. I mean, I lived in Argentina last year because I study Spanish, and I remember something that really baffled me was in Argentina they just seem to have this really strong association between feminism and being left-wing, and being really radically left-wing, and I mean, I'm not to say that I'm not left wing, that's another matter, but it just really frustrates me. I'm like, where is this coming from? And it was such a negative stereotype, like, yeah, feminists, they all shave all their hair off and they dress in a certain way and they're really radical and they, like, you know, support really left-wing policies, which are obviously very, it's a touchy subject in South America, because especially in Argentina, they've had some very awful, very corrupt left-wing governments. And so to be associated with the left wing is definitely not a good thing. Yeah, and it's so interesting to try and diagnose these and get past them. And yeah, I think it all ties back into how important feminism is in influencing education, but then also education about feminism, and making sure that people understand what we're actually fighting for here. Okay, right, well, if nobody has anything more to add on that question, I think this is a really good time to open it up to the audience.